thanks for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Stephen Sherlock, who's affiliated with both the University of New South Wales in Canberra and the Australian National University. I'm Natalie Sambhi from the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and today we'll be talking a little bit about Indonesia's elections and its political system. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sherlock.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, so our first question for today is that the election that occurred last year was probably one of the most bitterly fought in 15 years of Indonesia's democracy. Why was that the case? That was between Jokowi and Prabowo Subianto.
Well, one would make that assessment in comparison to the previous three elections, and especially the previous two elections that led to the election of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, SBY. Those two elections were quite peaceful. The result was not a surprise, especially in the second of the SBY elections. Everybody expected him to be elected. There was no really serious opposition, and everything pretty much went to script. This election, on the other hand, all bets were off because SBY couldn't stand again. There was something of a vacuum, and there was a lot of questions for the year or so leading up to the election about who would actually be a candidate. There was no clear front runner, and there wasn't even clear who might stand or who would have a real opportunity to stand. And what did happen, of course, was that a figure emerged who had been a previous presidential candidate, Prabowo, but who in his first run had very little chance of being elected. He made a very, very strong run, and he did it in a way which was paradigm breaking. He did it in a much more aggressive way. He campaigned extremely strongly. He spent a great deal of money, and he campaigned in a way that tried to bring about responses from a lot of Indonesians based on button-pushing sort of issues, defending the country against foreign misuse, foreign exploitation, attacking cronies and corrupt individuals, all of which was hugely hypocritical from his point of view. But he knew that he would get a lot of responses on that basis. And he also indulged in what Indonesians came to know as black campaigning, that is sending out dog whistle messages about his opponent Jokowi, that he had a Christian background, that he was not Islamic, various things that again were quite hypocritical given Prabowo's own family background with some Christians in it, but nevertheless was designed to sow seeds of doubt in many people's minds about the credentials of his opponents. And he really, I think, frightened a lot of people because he came from a very low position, a position in the polls of the mid-30s, and he made up a huge amount of ground in the months leading up to the poll by picking up all the undecided votes, or most of the undecided votes. And a lot of people started worrying, are we going to see this figure from the old regime, from the Suharto days, come back to power using these sorts of black campaign techniques? And so there was a last-minute mobilisation of people supporting Jokowi, but many people were surprised at the character and the intensity and sometimes the viciousness of the campaign. And it was quite a contrast to the previous election campaigns.
Could I just ask a follow-up question to that? What do you think the implications are of that particular election for future elections?
Well, in many ways, this showed Indonesian institutions standing up very well. Prabowo really came up to the cage and he shook it, and he pushed Indonesian democratic institutions to their limits. But the institutions held up very, very well. The election was probably the most fairly conducted, partly because of many civil society organisations and people generally being concerned about what the result was. There was spontaneous organisation of online groups that monitored the election result very, very closely. So any possibility for cheating was really eliminated, firstly by the quality of the election commission, but also by popular mobilisation. Prabowo, after the result, he refused to accept the result immediately, took a challenge to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court took it seriously, but very, very quickly dismissed his case. So I think it showed Indonesia's political institutions to be tested, but to have survived that test very, very well. So I think it does augur well, in that regard at least, for the future of Indonesian democracy.
I see. And now let's just turn a little bit to Indonesia's political system itself, a much more presidential system like the United States. Could you explain a little bit about how the powers of the president and the parliament work?
Yes, well, I think the really important thing to emphasise, particularly to an Australian audience or to people who are brought up in a Westminster system, is that Indonesia follows a system very similar to the US, where there is a very clear separation of powers between the legislature, the parliament, and the institution of the presidency. Both branches of government are elected separately, so it means that both branches of government can be controlled by different political forces. One party can control the presidency, such as, say, the Democrats in the US, while on the other hand the parliament be controlled by another party or by a coalition of parties, which of course has many of the similar effects as it has in the United States, is that there can be a deadlock between the two branches of government. And one of the most effective ways for opposition parties to oppose the government, to question the government, is to use the other branch of government as their mechanism for questioning and opposing the incumbent president.
Actually, well, that's going to be my next question. So that's a situation that we have in Indonesia now.
Right.
We've got Jokowi coming from PDIP and the coalition, the Merah Putih, which is controlling the parliament at the moment. What kind of strategies do you think, given Merah Putih's nature, you talked earlier about using opposing mechanisms, but given Merah Putih's nature, what do you expect their strategies might be to frustrate some of Jokowi's plans?
Well, there are a number of instruments at their disposal if they control the parliament. Now, controlling the parliament is a quite complicated story, which we need not dwell on just at the moment, but just given the assumption that they do control the parliament, there's a number of mechanisms that they have. First of all, they can oppose legislation that the president wants to put through to carry out his political mandate. They can also question appointments, key appointments of government officials, like the head of the police, for example, quite recently.
Controversial case at the moment.
Controversial case indeed. The head of the audit board, a whole range of appointments that they can question, and by doing that they can make a lot of trouble for the government. They can also make a lot of trouble for the government in the passage of the budget, because unlike in our system, where the passage of the budget is largely sewn up before it goes to the parliament, except in our Senate. But in the case of Indonesia, like the US Congress, line by line items are discussed in the parliament. And so the opposition, any oppositional forces in the parliament can use the budget to question, to obstruct, if they want to, government programs. So there's a range of mechanisms that they have at their disposal, but whether they have the capacity to actually do that is maybe another question we can look at.
Well, yeah, still early days, isn't it? I was actually going to ask, I mean, have there been any signs of success so far? I mean, given it's coming up to 3 whole months now of Jokowi's presidency.
Well, there hasn't been a single instance of a major issue where the parliament has been able to oppose the government. And that's partly because this coalition itself is still questionable in how effectively it operates. Its own solidarity is not very, very clear. But secondly, there just haven't been enough issues yet for the strength of this supposedly oppositional coalition to actually test its ability to operate. In fact, there has been one important instance, really, where the parliament seems to be backing down from a previous position that it took, because it was actually the previous parliament before the last election that passed a law, really at the 11th hour, immediately before the election, to change the system for electing regional government heads, which would have done away with popular election, the direct election, and gone back to the old system of the local parliaments electing the regional heads. Now, there was a very, very strong backlash against that, because people saw it as a reverse of the progress towards democracy. It was taking away the people's right to choose their leaders and giving it to the local legislatures. Now, as a result, of the passage of that law, remember it's the old Parliament that did this, SBY as President, one of these last actions was to pass a government regulation in lieu of law, which really reversed the effect of that law. The newly elected Parliament, even though it's made up of people who largely supported that initial legislation, they've indicated that they will support this new government regulation. So really they are just really reversing the position that most of them took in the earlier Parliament. And that's clearly a result of the very powerful public backlash that there was to this move. So I think we can see that at the first really severe test, this oppositional coalition has not shown itself to be particularly effective.
I see. Can we just delve a little bit further actually into the mechanisms of Parliament? In most cases there are a lot of committees obviously there, and a lot of decisions are made rather than in the plenary sessions by these committees. Can you just delve a little bit into the features of how this Parliament works and explain a little bit about how the government might pass a bill, for instance?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's two really key features to talk about and often surprise people when they hear this. First of all, that no votes take place in the Indonesian Parliament. Now let me qualify that
is
slightly.
Yes.
Our assumption, of course, is that in a Parliament people take votes. Majorities win, minorities concede. And therefore, having a majority of votes, 50% plus one, means that you control the Parliament. But generally speaking, votes do not happen in the Indonesian Parliament. Sometimes they do, but it's a very small minority. And what happens is that decisions are made by what I call so-called consensus. Now, I put in that phrase so-called consensus because the use of the phrase consensus can give the impression that everybody, every single individual member of Parliament must agree. It's not actually like that at all. In fact, what it really means is that decisions are made in backroom meetings when the leaders of each of the parliamentary caucuses, that is the parliamentary parties, put forward their position, they come up with a deal, and then they come out of their closed meetings and present it to the committee or the plenary session as consensus. And then the chair of the meeting or the speaker says, right, we've all agreed, bangs the gavel, the decision has been made. Supposedly, everybody has agreed. But in fact, really what it is that it's a consensus just of the leadership of the political parties. So there's that feature, which of course is a very untransparent system. Nobody knows exactly who said what on any issue. No individual member is able to register any dissent if they want to vote against a bill. They can't do that under that system. And the second feature is that almost all decisions, meaningful decisions, important decisions, are made in committee. They're not like in our Parliament. They don't take place in the plenary session, in an open session. Mostly decisions are made in committee, then that decision is sent to the plenary session, which just endorses it in a largely ceremonial role. Now, as I said, there are exceptions to that. There are one or two bills, a few bills that have been voted on in the plenary session, but 95% probably of bills are decided in the committees. Now, the really important thing about that is that the committees sort of act like they take the role that is usually taken by political parties in our Parliament and most other parliaments. They really decide on the policy in most legislation, for example. And the political parties actually do not play very much of a role in directing their members when it comes to policy issues.
I was just going to ask, I mean, there doesn't seem to be a lot of pressure on individuals if they're making decisions behind closed doors to toe the party line, is there?
That's right, and that there isn't. But secondly, there rarely is a party line.
Right.
And that's something that people often get confused by. There is a perception that Indonesian political parties are very top-heavy and controlled by their central leaders. And that's true if it's an issue that the central leaders care about, that is something that affects them, or it's an appointment of some official that they want to be appointed to a particular position. Yes, then the central machines do exercise a lot of control. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty of policy issues, especially those in legislation, for example, should the school leaving age be 16 or 17? Should this particular policy on health be followed, or should some other slightly different policy be pursued. All those hard technical issues, the parties virtually never have a policy position. They'll have one or two people within the committee that may have a personal interest, a personal expertise, and they will often talk as if they represent the party, but usually they're just expressing their own opinion. So what that means is that the parties actually don't have an incentive to, and therefore up until now, have not exercised a great deal of control over their members within the committees. Mm-hmm. So if there is an oppositional coalition, as we see today, if they want to change policy in legislation that the government has introduced, they need to develop mechanisms to exercise discipline. And up until now, they haven't been able to do that. So this is one of the things that make me question the capacity of this oppositional coalition to actually provide significant opposition in policy terms to what the government wants to do. They can make a lot of trouble, yeah, but they haven't yet shown themselves able to argue an alternative set of policies.
I see. Given the absence of what you described as disciplinary measures for people to align within their parties, and what role, if not to get members to vote in a particular way, unless it's an issue that the leaders care about, what role do the political parties have in the legislature, and how do parties decide how they form a coalition, and what are the strengths of those coalitions?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to give the impression that political parties are not important.
Okay, sure.
They are extremely important in an overall political sense. They, of course, control the overall makeup of the chamber, the general political character of the chamber. And also, they potentially do exercise a very powerful control over their members, because unlike in our system, where a member of parliament owns his or her own seat, in the Indonesian Parliament, it's the party that owns the seat. So the party wins the seat in the election, they determine who actually occupies that seat. So a member of parliament in Indonesia cannot resign from the party and still keep his or her seat as they can in Australia. So through those mechanisms, parties have a great deal of potential power. They could exercise a lot of discipline over their members if they wanted to, but the history of it has been that when it has come to policy issues, they have rarely been able to, as I said before, develop any really significantly different set of policies. They always maintain control over their members when it comes to making sure that they don't embarrass the party, say things out of turn, whether they are involved in corruption cases and so forth. Over those sorts of issues, members of parliament have frequently been dismissed by their parties, but only in one or two cases have they been dismissed because of policy differences.
I see. And actually, speaking of policy, how can policy be achieved actually, if not by the parliament? Are there other means and other mechanisms by which a government or the president might achieve a policy goal outside of, if we're looking at a potentially frustrating coalition in the parliament?
Mm-hmm. Now, that's a very important question, because it gets to the whole issue of the relative power of the two branches of government. Because the Indonesian Parliament, since a series of constitutional reforms 10 years ago, has a great deal of constitutional power. In theory, it has a great deal of power, but its actual power to exercise that authority is quite limited, and that's for a range of reasons. Let's just look at some of those reasons. First of all, the President has at his disposal a power to make government regulations that have the same status as law without it actually being passed by the Parliament. And that's exactly what SBY did before in that example that I cited regarding the election of local governments. The President, he or she, can pass one of these regulations and that becomes law. The law has to be endorsed by the Parliament at the next sitting, but of course that then becomes a political issue for the Parliament, whether or not they actually take on the President and disallow his or her regulation, or they back away from the fight and they let it go through. Now, in this case of that regulation that I cited, they say that they are going to back away from a fight on that and to allow that regulation to go through. So the President there has a very, very powerful instrument. The President can also pass presidential regulations, which are sort of executive orders. Ministers can also pass regulations. Presidential regulations don't actually have to refer to a particular bill. This is one of the controversial elements of it. The President can pass a regulation without actually saying its legitimacy comes from this particular law. So that's another powerful instrument the President has at his or her disposal. And there's a range of those. But I think the other point to make is that in the last 10 years, if there has been a disagreement between the government ministry and the committee over some policy issue within a piece of legislation, usually the Parliament has backed off. Not always, but usually they have. And part of the reason for that is that executive government ministries have so many more resources at their disposal. They've got the whole power of the public service, the whole power of the bureaucracy that has a long history of developing legislation and of negotiating around. Whereas the Parliament itself, there's just the individual members, they have very, very few advisors, and as I said before, their parties are very, very weak in policy terms. So often if it comes to a policy or political standoff between a parliamentary committee and a government ministry, usually the government ministry gets its way.
I mean, from what you're describing, it sounds as though the bureaucracy has more strength in this regard than what would be elected officials, which is the Parliament. I mean, are there advantages to this system, or are there disadvantages to this system, or strengths and weaknesses?
Well, your observation is absolutely right. And this is one of the key issues that faces the Jokowi government, the new president's government, that he has inherited a bureaucracy which is still very much a product of the Suharto era, of a bureaucracy that sees itself almost as a separate centre of power, that it's got its own ideas when it comes to policy, and it's got its own set of interests that they want to push when it comes to particular areas of government responsibility. So one of the things that the new president is going to have to do is to assert his power over the bureaucracy and get them to follow the president's directions rather than to have the bureaucracy setting, which the president then has to catch up with.
What happens if he doesn't, do you think, and what will happen to the public if that doesn't happen?
Well, I think what would happen is something very similar to what happened under the previous president's incumbency, where he did not take up the task of reforming the bureaucracy. He kept the existing structure, largely, of the bureaucracy in place, and he didn't challenge the political power of the bureaucracy. And that was part of the reason why the SBY years were marked by very little progress. Very little progress in reform, very little progress in tackling key issues such as corruption, such as poor infrastructure, a whole range of issues that were not tackled, partly because the SBY did not take on the issue of reforming the machinery of government. And if the current president takes the same path, we're likely to see a repetition of that. But all the signs are that Jokowi really does want to take on the bureaucracy. He certainly has a reputation of doing that. And in his previous roles as a regional governor, he had a very strong reputation of taking no abuse, of no obstruction at all from his officials. And in fact, publicly embarrassing them if necessary. So we're likely to see a lot of movement in that space, potentially, in the next 5 years.
And is that feasible, though? I mean, he was working, obviously, at a local and then at the provincial level. Working at the national level, obviously, is a different question. What key steps do you think he should take first in order to start that reform process?
Well, that's a very important point. Taking on the local government bureaucracy is one thing. In a small city like Solo, where he was the mayor, or even taking on the bureaucracy in a large city like Jakarta, is one thing. But the entire national bureaucracy is quite another task. It's a whole different order of magnitude. And so what he really has to do is to develop a clear set of policy goals, and also to get his own coalition on side, because there has been a lot of talk about potential obstruction from the Parliament, which is what we have been talking about. But there's also the issue of his own political party and his own coalition, because that's a diverse coalition. And within his own political party, PDIP, which is headed by Megawati Sukarno Putri, he actually has quite a weak position, because he never held a key machine position within that party, and he's seen by many people as under the control of Megawati. And Megawati, I think, sees Jokowi as owing something to her. That it's only because she supported his candidacy within the party that he was able to become president, and therefore he has to listen to her. And there are a lot of signs that Megawati is exercising a great deal of power behind the scenes in Jokowi's ministry.
Can you give us an example?
Yes, well, a very important example happened in the earliest days of the new administration with the appointment of the cabinet. Many people were quite disappointed by that cabinet. It was not a clearly reformist cabinet. There were no really outstanding figures that were strongly committed or had a record of commitment to reform. There was a lot of political party hacks in it, some of them better than others. And there are a number of members of the cabinet who most observers have concluded were handpicked by Megawati herself. A second example is what you did allude to a moment ago, very recent controversy about the appointment of the chief of the police. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but most of the commentary is saying that this new candidate for head of the police was appointed because of his closeness to Megawati and because he was supported by Megawati. Now, as it turns out, this individual is under accusations of corruption. And the Corruption and Eradication Commission, when they heard of his nomination for this post, made it public that he was a suspect for corruption. But Jokowi has continued to support his candidacy, and that has caused a lot of consternation amongst very many people about Jokowi's capacity to appoint clean figures and to do it if it goes against the interests of forces within his own party. So not only does Jokowi have to get the bureaucracy on side, not only does he have to have the Parliament working with him rather than against him, he's also got that much more difficult task of actually controlling his own cabinet and controlling his own political party.
Challenges ahead.
Indeed.
Actually, so you've given us a very thorough overview of the political party workings thus far, and we talked a little bit about the future of elections. I'd like to ask you now, finally, about the future of the political system itself, given what we've seen so far in the last 12 months with the election, but also Jokowi's style so far. What do you see happening in Indonesian politics and shifts in political culture?
Well, I think it's a fascinating time for people like myself as an observer of Indonesian politics. It's a really, really interesting time, because what we're seeing is the coming together of the old and the new. The old style of politics is still very, very powerful. Most of the leading figures in politics today are still people that were powerful under the old regime. We're talking about Megawati. She's a clear example of that. She was at the margins under the Suharto regime, but she was able to operate within the Suharto regime. She's a figure of the old order of government. Prabowo Subianto, who we've talked about, who was the losing candidate in the last election, also very much a figure of the old order. Backroom politics, military background being very, very important. And they're the sort of people who benefit from that consensus, so-called consensus that we were talking about, where the key decisions are made in backroom meetings and it's presented to everybody as a consensus. So that sort of politics is still operating in a very powerful way. But on the other hand, new things are happening. Jokowi himself is, of course, a product of the new kind of politics, because he's not an insider. he is in his position purely because of electoral politics, because of his popular standing. There are three traditional ways that people came to power in Indonesia in the past. One was to be from a powerful family, like Megawati. The other was to be from the military, to be some sort of strongman figure. And the third was to come from the bureaucracy that we talked about. And many of those people went from the military or the bureaucracy into local government politics and then into national politics. Jokowi, why am I saying that? Jokowi is none of those people. He was, as we talked about before, a mayor of a small city, developed a very powerful reputation for his policies and for his opposition to corruption, and therefore he's a symbol of the new type of politics where people are now exercising their democratic rights. And one thing I've noticed over the last 10 years observing Indonesian politics is that we can see an emergence of political activity, political awareness and political engagement in a way that was not the case before. And that's something observable just in the last 3 or 4 years even. Before, under the old regime, people were deliberately depoliticised. Nobody was allowed to talk politics. Elections were a farce. And it took a long time, even when people had the vote, to actually understand that democracy is more than just marking a ballot paper once every 5 years. It's also about being able to express your opinion, that you're able to shout out when you don't like something, that you're able to form an organisation, that you can discuss with your friends on social media. So there's a new emerging political consciousness which is challenging that old backroom way of doing things. There's a lot more calls for accountability. Making an appointment of the police chief that we just talked about would have been easy in the old days. Now people are screaming and shouting about it. There's a lot more accountability because of political awareness. And so therefore, when it comes to election time, parties now have to compete much more strongly to get the vote of people. Previously they could rely on their image of being an Islamic party or a nationalist party and expect people to vote for them. Now parties have to show that they've actually got something to offer. So we're at this really interesting cusp where the old politics is still operating, but that's being challenged by the growth of a genuine democracy. One last point on that though. Democracy as it operates in the West is something that Indonesia is starting to look more and more like. It's starting to look more and more like a normal democracy. 15 years on, it's starting to look like US, Australia, British, European democracy. But of course there's a nasty side to that as well. And that is dog whistle politics, media manipulation, using various means to undermine people's image or presenting purely an image with very little substance behind it. All of those things were epitomised by the candidacy of Prabowo. So of course there's dangers that come along with that new style of politics as well, but they're the sort of dangers that we're very familiar with. And I don't think many Australians really understand that Indonesia now is much more like us in terms of the way its politics works. It's an open electoral system where people are able to express their opinions. It's no longer controlled by the military, and the old forces are being challenged more and more. And as I said, that's a very, very interesting thing to watch.
Wonderful. We look forward to seeing what happens in 2019.
Okay.
So thank you very much again for your insights today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And
thanks to you for joining us today. If you'd like to see more of the AIIA's product, please visit our website www.internationalaffairs.org.au, and don't forget to visit our blog Australian Outlook as well. Thanks very much.